I'll start with the front group. Normally I use some naphtha to wipe the mount. Make sure there's no grease or dirt on the lens mount, keeping away from the glass. Then I'll take some glass cleaner on the end of a cotton bud and clean the glass itself. Okay, that was the inner surface. I'll do the same for the outer surface and then check my result. And it's not uncommon, you've got to go back in and do the inner surface again, because you can now see things that you couldn't see easily before. I'm just angling this around in the light, looking through it out the window. That looks pretty good. I'll go around it once more with the glass cleaner. Now, with any lens that's 60 something years old, it's likely to have some marks to show its age. So don't go crazy trying to get rid of marks that obviously aren't going to go. If there are marks in the glass, no amount of cleaning is going to make them go away. All that you can do is make a mess of it, make it worse. With the lens on the shutter, you can often get more of an impression of how clean you've got those surfaces, because you've got that black shutter behind it. I'll just have another look at this front surface. Sometimes there's an oily haze on a lens, particularly the inside surfaces. That can be very, very difficult to see the back of. Well, that looks very good to me. I'm pleased with the look of that. So we'll say that the front group is just great. But the rear group, much the same story with this one. I start with naphtha cleaning around the mount, keeping off the glass, because the rear group is probably going to be the greasiest. And I don't want any of that grease getting on that glass, because it'll just make life more awkward. You can see how much filth came off there. Okay, now start with cleaning the glass. I'll clean the outside surface first because that's convex. It's easier to tell by it from the reflections how clean you've got something on a convex surface than it is on a concave surface. Well, it's got a bit of a greasy look to it, but it's coming clean. It's that hint of fungus or whatever it was on the surface has appeared to disappear completely. Okay, so now I'm going to do the inside surface. Now very rarely do you need to take these apart. There are 3 pieces of glass in the front group, 3 pieces of glass in the rear group. In each case there's a cemented pair. So obviously you can do nothing for the cemented layer. But if you take them apart you can get to the other layers. I'll hold that up to the light. That cleaned up very nicely. It was somewhat doubtful looking to start off with, but that did clean up very well. So it means that whatever was on there was just a haze on the surface, and what appeared to be a fungus growth possibly was a fungus growth, but it was limited to that oily haze that was on the surface and hadn't etched into the coating. Let's put this onto the shutter and have another look at this. As with the front group, it's easier to judge how clean you've got the glass when you're looking into a nice dark shutter. That's good. That's a good result. Very pleased with that. So that's our shutter. What else have we got to deal with the shutter? Well, we've got the retaining ring and the shims. And these are all greasy and need to be cleaned. Starting with this paper shim, this may be 2 paper shims. They may be glued together with the oil. Or it may be 1. And the metal shim, that's very oily as well. The oil, of course, it's oils that have sweated out of the helical grease in the main. I'm just going to inspect this paper shim, see if I can determine whether it's 2 pieces stuck together or whether it's 1. No, there you go. There's 2 pieces stuck together. I've got to get the oil out of the internal surfaces. If you don't remove the oil from a place like this, it'll find its way into the shutter all that much quicker. And the lens retaining, well, the shutter retaining ring here, that's usually greasy. It's no surprises there. That looks okay otherwise. Normally with these, I'd normally put the paper shims in place on the shutter first. If there's a metal shimmer being used, I'd put that on last, so that's against the camera body, so I'm less likely to tear it up while I'm trying to fit the shutter. I'll put that to one side. That's our shutter assembly all done. We have the top cover done, the rangefinder done, all the camera body parts are cleaned and ready for reassembly. So with a bit of luck, it should be a straight run to reassembly. Now I noticed that the leatherettes on the back here are coming adrift. At both ends, and to some extent in the middle too. I don't know whether it's worth trying to fight that leatherette off completely. I suppose it might. I'll have a look, I'll see what it's like. There's no point looking for trouble. Depends how easily it lifts. Oh, it's lifting pretty easy. Okay. Now be cautious around that embossed area there. The leatherettes are obviously thin there where the pattern's been impressed into it, and it makes them more fragile at that point. And here the scalpel, I'm using it more as a lever than anything else to lever up that leatherette. Right, it's off. Let's have a look at this. Well, it looks like adhesive failure to me. I think the adhesive has just given up the ghost. I don't think there's anything particularly sinister in here, and I will use some thinners on here to shift it off the metal. Here I'll be much more cautious. I'll scrape off the lumps. I'll give it a wipe with naphtha, but nothing more aggressive than that, and then glue it back in place. I probably could have got away with just gluing the loose ends because the middle's not going to fall off. It's got nowhere to go. But it's probably just as well to have this all apart and do the job once, and then it'll be done. It won't be my pigeon after that. So I'm just going to apply some of the CRC Lectraclean here, because this is usually pretty good at shifting old adhesive of that nature. And let's see if it is. I can see the stuff bubbling up. There you go. That's just coming straight off. Be careful splashing around stuff like this because you don't want it on the leatherettes, it will damage them. This is just a gooey, sort of a jelly-like mess here. It'd take me 10 minutes to get this lot clean. I'll bring you back when I'm done. Time for the reassembly, I think. As you can see, the leatherette's back on. I did remove the leatherette from one side of the front. I certainly wished I hadn't. It did not go well. But it's back on and it's looking okay. What are we going to need for this job? Well, one of the things we're going to need is a brand new shutter cocking rack because the original one is shot. And we'll need that pretty much straight away because it's used to help space the position of this bracket that holds this transfer shaft. So let's get that in place. So I've checked that transfer shaft and I'm quite happy with the state of the teeth on that. It doesn't seem to have been damaged by that rack, which was clearly slipping over the top of it. This bracket holds that in place with a small screw that comes in from the top here. Now the bracket holds, this bracket here also supports the cocking rack at this point. If it's pushed too far back, the cocking rack will be too tight, it won't want to move. If that bracket's too far forward, the cocking rack will slop about in the track, and if that happens, the gear and the teeth on the top cocking rack won't be engaged across their full width. So you need a bit of clearance in there, and I've found from experience about 4/1000ths of an inch is just about the right amount. So if I put a feeler gauge in there, check that, and the rack's moving nice and smoothly, make sure the bracket is sitting nice and square. That seems to run nicely. Just looking to see if there's anything rubbing there that shouldn't be. Seems to be sufficient clearance. I think that'll be good. Okay, well with that spacing set, I will lock the position of that screw with a touch of lacquer. I can't lock the position of the bracket underneath it, which would be preferable because I won't be able to slide in the front section if I did that. So I just want to lock the head of that screw so it doesn't loosen up and is not likely to shift. Okay, so the front standard, this part. First off, we need this piece here. This finger-shaped object transfers the action from the shutter release component, called the sleeve, through to the arm on the shutter itself. It should be nice and square here. Sometimes people have bent that down in an attempt to adjust the stroke of the shutter. That's not the way to do it. And often if people have been poking and prodding in there with screwdrivers and pliers to bend things, they end up damaging stuff. So it's not uncommon to find that a bit bent out of shape. See if we can get this screw started. Just ran out of card space there. I was just saying that just getting this screw in is not easy. The spring pushes up against it and wants to push the screw head out of position. That's all done. That's in place. That's in place. That's moving smoothly enough. Now normally I lubricate this with a touch of graphite powder, because graphite powder never goes sticky with age. So I'll just work that in, go and blow out the excess, and then we'll move on. That's moving nicely. Okay, so assembling the front standard to the shroud. We want the buttons and their spring. The springs, sometimes they get a bit compacted. I'll give them a little tweak to open them up a bit. Should be good. Right. Bit of synthetic grease around here and around here where the buttons are going to go. The springs go in the holes, they do not go over the post. Don't put them over the post, it won't work. The buttons are identical top and bottom. Get them in position, holding them compressed with one hand. All that spring's popped out of place while I was handling this. Let's get that spring back where it should be. Alright, feed this into the front standard. Into the shroud rather. Okay, push that through, pops into place. Check the action of that. That appears nice and smooth. So some synthetic grease in here. On the rail, top and bottom. And top and bottom in the middle where that sprung loaded button is going to run. That pops nicely. This piece is called the sleeve. That can go in now. Slide that in from the side. Collapse the front partly like that to keep the sleeve in place so it can't fall out. Bring the camera body back into the picture. Slide the whole shroud and front standard into position. We have 4 screws. 2 at the top, 2 at the bottom. The 2 at the bottom are often rust stained or covered in adhesive or both. The 2 at the top are not, but they're often a little bit ugly from being over tightened or tightened enough. Don't press down on the screws. There are just inserts inside that shroud that are pushed into place, and they push out of place fairly easily. So you press down on the screws, you'll push those inserts straight out, and then it's trouble getting them all back in position again. Right, there's our 4 screws all in position. Now I can tighten the screws up. As I press down on the camera back opens because we're pressing down on that catch. That becomes very annoying, so at about this stage it's time to put the little insert in for the film cassette chamber and put the tripod socket on. Right, 3 screws present and correct. I can tighten them up. And now I can bang that to my heart's content on the table. It's not going to fall off. I think I'll put the rewind shaft in place at this stage. If I can gather the pieces together. The inside piece has got a little detent spring around it, halfway up. It's got a little tab on the end which keys it to the shaft. That should slide in there. The detent spring should go in there fairly easily. And there we have the shaft together. The bush at the top's got a wee spring inside, a little brass spring. Just put some synthetic grease in there, and I can feed the shaft up into it. 2 screws hold that bush in place. Both in place, tighten the screws up. That's great. Now I can put my shutter release shaft in place. Now there may or may not be a return spring with the shutter release. I think in this case there was. Slide that in from the top. And the spring's got to go in here if we can find one. I think I can see it. I'll zoom you in. Here we go. And the spring has to go on over the shutter release shaft. Here, let's open this up. Let's get this spring seated because it's not sitting in the right place at the moment. That's better. That's an extra return spring. Some Retina 3Cs, 2C types will have it, some will not. Some began their life with that spring, but it was lost. The cameras will get round by fine without it, if it's not present, as long as everything else is clean and running nicely. At this stage I want to run a rubber band across here so that this shutter release shaft can't fall out and lose the spring, which has a terrible bad habit of falling down between the shroud and the bellows, where it'll sit quietly until it feels like it, then it'll get in somewhere and jam things up. So you can see I've got a rubber band across the top here now to stop that falling off. And that simply stops the shutter release shaft from falling out, because if it does, it causes no end of grief. Okay, so far so good. But at the front here, you can start getting the focus mount and stuff together.